All right, welcome to our first lesson on Unit 11, topic 11.1, Napoleon Rises. Unit 11 is going to be about global empires at war as we are marching closer and closer to the modern day. The goal of today's lesson is for you to be able to explain why Napoleon Bonaparte was able to take power after the French Revolution and rebuilt centralized authority in France. So we've been talking about Napoleon. He's been popping up in our lessons last unit. This is where we're really going to dig into Napoleon and learn about why he's such a big force in world history. So the problem here is that the French Revolution destroyed the old system, right? The feudal system, the absolute monarch. This was destroyed by the French Revolution as it started in 1789 by literally cutting off the head of the king. Now the old systems collapsed, the monarchy was overthrown, the nobility lost political power, and the church itself also had its influence reduced greatly in the French Revolution. So these old systems that held everything together, absolute power, the church, nobility, these things are collapsing in the French Revolution, and something needs to replace it. Now, the French revolutionaries had really hoped they could replace the old systems with something brand new based on the ideas of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. But that resulted, as we saw, in increased political instability, economic crises, foreign wars, violence throughout the inside of the country, so that new system wasn't really holding up very well. In fact, during the French Revolution, right, this period right here, they tried 4 separate times to have a democratic government based on the ideals of the Enlightenment put into place before the final 5th version, the Second Directory, was taken over by Napoleon. Now, America, we had 2 bites of the apple before we got our Constitution, but the French, they tried it 4 times and then succumbed to a dictator. The French Revolution created new freedoms as the shackles of the lower classes were finally released and the old systems were torn apart. But that new freedom also created new dangers. Not everyone was happy with the new system, and so that led to increased civil war with no absolute monarch holding everything together. At the same time, France was at war with other European monarchs who weren't happy with seeing another fellow monarch having their head cut off by a bunch of revolutionaries, so those countries were still attacking France. Then, remember the economic instability that happened that kind of launched this whole revolution? Well, they still hadn't figured out how to get the economy back on stable footing, which meant a lot of people were still starving. Combine that with weak leadership in the government, and, well, you've got a recipe for disaster. And a lot of people started asking a new question. Is stability more important than freedom? After all, under the absolute monarch of the kings of France, the House of Bourbon, they had some stability, but they had no freedom. Now they've got a lot of freedom, but they've got no stability. Enter into this fray a young Napoleon Bonaparte. There he is. Look how handsome that man is. He was a young military officer in the French army, so he was in the king's army as an artilleryman. During the revolution, he gained a lot of attention by defending the revolutionary government from the king's army. That's right, he switched sides early on to join the revolutionary army to defend it against the king's army. And he was given commission of his own soldiers, his own army, and he was told to protect against the attacks of the invading Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Sardinia. And while everything else is going chaotic in France, Napoleon is winning these battles, and that makes him very, very popular with the French people who just want to be, great again. After all, the French Empire, the French kingdom, was the most powerful and important kingdom and empire in Europe at this time. And the French Revolution came along and kind of ruined all that, at least the prestige part. So his military successes made him very popular with the public, and people saw him as someone who could restore order and defend France from this chaos. Stop me if you heard this story before, because this is the exact same thing essentially that happened with Julius Caesar way back at the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. So a little foreshadowing here of what's going to happen. So 10 years after the revolution starts, the real turning point here, the coup d'etat, is 1799. 10 years later, the government known as the Directory had lost support from the people, as the previous versions of the government have lost support of the people. It was seen as corrupt, ineffective, and unable to manage the war or the economy at a time when the people were starving, inflation was high, and other countries wouldn't stop attacking the new French government. Well, it's during this time Napoleon was over in Egypt fighting wars, trying to, basically cut the British off from their colony in India by taking over Egypt from the Ottomans. It was a whole thing that really didn't go as well as planned, and said he knew he was going to lose this battle. So Napoleon sees the political crisis going on back in France, and he leaves Egypt here. You can see the pyramids in the background where this big famous battle was. He leaves Egypt knowing they're going to lose, returns back to France, and he essentially sends troops to surround the legislature, the Directory. So these are the elected officials of the new French Republic, at least the 4th version of the government they tried to establish, and Napoleon surrounds it with troops and says, hey, guess what? I need you to have a vote to put me in charge. And well, the lawmakers who were still in the building said, yeah, I guess we're going to put this guy in charge of the government. This military seizure of power is known as a coup d'etat. It's a French word, essentially a military seizure of the government. It's at this point that Napoleon names himself First Consul of the Republic. He's effectively a dictator at this point. You notice he's using the term consul because that's what the leaders of the Roman Republic were called. And remember, the last consul who was named dictator was Julius Caesar, who refused to give that power back. So you can see he's kind of following this pattern of Julius Caesar. Now, the people had fought long and hard. This revolution had been going on for 10 years. They killed the king. They've cut off all these heads. They're demanding the ideals of the Enlightenment be put into place, and they want a republic much like they have in the United States. So why would they accept Napoleon as essentially a dictator? Well, a lot of the people actually willingly supported him because once he took power, people were just exhausted from the chaos of the revolution. They said, yeah, freedom was great, but look all the chaos that started. We'd rather have stability and order. This is the trade-off a lot of people keep making in the world, right? I'd rather be stable and safe than have my freedom. Now, of course, if you go too far in one direction, to the stability and order, you get an absolute dictatorship. If you go too far in the other direction, you get the reign of terror. The trick is we all have to figure out where that best mix between stability, order, and freedom are. They also had a lot of respect for him because while everything else was going terrible for the French people, Napoleon's army kept winning, and so this was something they could be proud of. Again, you can see another, parallel here with Julius Caesar and his winning of these victories in Gaul, expanding the Roman Republic at the time that, the Republic itself in Rome was falling apart. And as he was such a great military leader, people were still afraid that these other empires were going to keep invading France, and that was something they were terrified for, an invasion. And why not put a great military leader in charge when you're in danger of all these other threats from coming in and taking over your land? So in short, people accepted him because he promised security, stability, and national pride. Things people were craving when they just weren't feeling good about being French and they didn't really like all the chaos of the revolution, so they gave up their freedom to a dictator. And this is something people often do throughout history. In a time of crisis, we'll accept strong authority and dictatorship if it just means we'll be safe, even if it means giving up our freedom. And Napoleon didn't completely reverse the revolution. He actually kept some of the revolutionary changes in place while strengthening government power at the same time. For instance, the tax system, which was completely corrupt under the old king, he actually got that all straightened out for the French people and created a national banking system to stabilize the economy. So people loved this. Corrupt officials in the government were also removed because he didn't have to deal with any bureaucracy or voting. He just said, no, you're corrupt, you're fired, I'm not dealing with you. He also established government-run schools so that everyone could get an education because, well, there was no such thing as public schools at this time. So combined, these reforms stabilized both the French economy and the French government, which people were desperately hoping for. Now, during the Revolution, religion had weakened drastically within the French Empire. Many people wanted the church to be restored, especially the people in the countryside and the lower-class peasants. They were still deeply, deeply Catholic, and they didn't like how the French Revolution was trying to push religion out of life altogether. So Napoleon signed a deal with the Pope. He recognized the Catholic Church as having a legitimate place in French life, but he kept the Church under the authority of the state, giving him more control over the Catholic Church within the boundaries of the new empire. So you can see here Napoleon going back to the old playbook of asking the Pope for blessing in order to be seen as legitimate by the people. And as complete dictator, he created what was known as the Napoleonic Code, Napoleon's most important reform, the legal system. So he went through all the laws and he kind of straightened them out, much like Justinian did in the Byzantine Empire, 1,000 years earlier. So he simplified the laws, made them more straightforward, promoted equality before the law, so no longer would nobles be treated differently than people lower on the social hierarchy, and he made sure that property rights would be protected so that the middle-class bourgeois, the wealthy merchants, they could keep doing business as usual and make money for themselves. But he also strengthened the power of the government. He limited freedom of speech in the press. You really weren't able to speak out against him, either verbally or in writing. That would be cracked down severely because you had to respect Napoleon. He also restored slavery in the French colonies, which brought him into conflict with Toussaint Louverture over in Haiti, as we saw in the last unit. In short, no pun intended, Napoleon prioritized order and control over individual liberty. An American journalist once quipped that the average man doesn't want to be free. He wants to be safe, and Napoleon recognized that, which essentially means we'll willingly give up our freedom if it means we can be safe. We'll hand over our freedom and our power over to a dictator if they promise us safety. This is something that happens over and over again in history, and it never ends well for the people who gave up their freedom to the dictator. So, well, nominally, Napoleon is technically an elected leader at this point as first consul. This all changes in 1804 when he decides he wants to expand his power even further. So in 1804, he kind of invites the Pope over to crown him Emperor of France in a very big ceremony that basically restores the monarchy and things like that. But now instead of the House of Bourbon, the family of the Bourbons being in charge, it will be the Bonapartes that are in charge. But right before the representative of the church is about to put the crown on his head, symbolically showing that the church made him king, he grabs the crown into his own hands and places it on his own head. And this is seen as a moment where he's showing the people that his authority comes from himself and the people of France, not the church, breaking with tradition. And for the most part, the French people supported this change with a public vote because why not? Things are stable now. We have order. We have safety. We're winning all these wars. Everyone's looking up at France again as this great place to be feared and worshipped. So why not let Napoleon be emperor? You see how he uses the language and the tools of the revolution in order to do the exact opposite of what the Enlightenment was calling for, and how the people of France willingly let this happen. It is at this moment the new French Empire is formed. Napoleon uses his military victories to expand French influence far across Europe. You can see here this purplish outline border is all the territories that are either directly controlled by Napoleon or indirectly controlled by Napoleon. Because of his military victories, he's not only got control of, well, France itself, but he's got control over parts of the Italian peninsula over here. He's got control of the Netherlands up here, some parts of Germany under his direct control. At the same time, he's got puppet governments over here in the Confederation of the Rhine, over here in Spain, over here in this region. These puppet governments are, well, they're technically independent, but he puts the people in charge. Generally, his brothers are placed in charge of these governments. So they're not really independent. And then over here, you got the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, this yellow area, but they've become allies with Napoleon as he marries a Habsburg. So he divorces his actual wife, the love of his life, in order to marry a Habsburg daughter to cement an alliance with the Habsburg Empire. This has become the largest empire Europe has seen ever since Rome collapsed. But there is structural vulnerability built into this, right? His empire looks very, very powerful and impressive from the outside, but it has its weaknesses. It depended heavily on constant military victories, right? And the reason people let him be in charge is because he seemed unbeatable. He also conquered all these lands, right? All these green areas are basically puppet governments. These brown areas aren't part of France, and over there in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, he conquered them, but he needs the people he's conquered to be loyal to him. And he needs rival powers like the British, the Portuguese, the Austrian, and the Habsburgs, right? They married into the family, but they don't really like Napoleon. The Russians over here, he needs to have at least some control over what they're doing in order to keep power. Or at least they have to be afraid enough of him not to challenge him. Large empires built on conquest are often very unstable, right? Other people don't like it when you come in and conquer them. And these weaknesses will eventually lead to Napoleon's downfall, which we'll be exploring in our next lesson in class. Looking ahead, Napoleon's empire spreads revolutionary ideas across Europe, even if not true enlightenment, but a lot of these ideas of getting rid of the old monarchs are kind of spreading fast, and this is making the monarchs very unhappy. So it creates a lot of fear among those monarchs. And other nations start to form alliances against him to stop him because he seems to be pretty much unbeatable at this time. Right? You look at this map here, and you can see the dark green areas are areas that are under Napoleon's direct control. The light green areas are areas that are indirectly under his control through alliances or puppet governments. Well, it's going to take a lot to beat this guy. But as we'll see in our next lesson, the best way to beat a strong man, someone who claims to be unbeatable, is, well, let them beat themselves. And we'll look at that in the next lesson. But for now, rewrite that goal, identify those 3 facts, again, type them out, complete sentences, complete thoughts, and one question you still have that I'll answer for you. Until I see you in class next, have a good one.